way that we start to talk about racism in New Zealand has to move away from this kind of thing of you're a personal racist in your behaviour, to the fact that the way in which the system is set up is so pejorative so often that it enables people to benefit one way if you're white and not if you're not.
E te waiti, e te waita, rauranga tira mā. Nau mai, hara mai, ki tēnei, kōnai ipurangi. Kia ora and welcome to Mai Te Rā, a podcast where we talk about racism, what it's doing to our health and how we can change that. My guest today is Pat Sneddon. Kia ora, Pat. Thank you so much for being here. Tell us a bit about your role, how you came to be in that position, and maybe some stories about racism that you've experienced.
Well, the current role I'm in is the chair of the District Health Board in Auckland. It's a role actually I've done before in the early 2000s, both here and in counties. But most recently in 2018, the Minister of Health got in touch with me and asked me if I'd be prepared to do it. And I said I would, but I thought I'd done it before. So the things that were important to me were, if I was to take this on again, then the thing we actually had to do was pay attention to Te Riti o Waitangi, to actually have that front and centre in the way that we went about our processes, and to actually balance the books. So if he was happy for me to do that, I'd be happy to have a go at seeing if we could expand the understanding and the capability in our system to be far better responsive to Maori in the provision of care, and in an equity basis to actually be smarter with Pacifica as well. So we took that on as a proposition. And I think it kind of caught people a bit by surprise. And I thought about it, and I went and spoke to Whaia Nader Clavish and to some of the Maori grouping in the DHBs and Waitemataran here, and said, I think this needs a whole lot of conversations. Would you be up for me getting out on the road and going to talk to the DHBs around the country, around the north, and to see whether or not there is an appetite for a really significant shift in this space? So that kicked off 85 conversations in a year, and they were fantastic conversations. I went to see boards in session. I went to see their Māori teams. I went to see their Māori providers. I talked to a whole heap of people, anybody, Pacific groupings, anybody who wanted to have a conversation I talked about. And I went with kind of half a dozen questions, what's working for you, what's not? What would you want to see if this was to be different? Why are you getting the results you're getting at the moment, and why aren't you getting better results? What's in the way of making this work? If we were to change the way we operated, would you do it? And in all those conversations, people were contributive, they were collaborative, they were challenging, really challenging. And it was great for a white guy to be out in that space, carrying the mana of the DHB chair role, but actually being kind of open to and hearing the pushback and the feedback about this. And quite a lot of it was around dealing with what people largely described as what they'd sort of systematic racism within the health systems.
Right.
The fact that Māori and Pacific weren't getting a fair deal around this. That at the same time the Waitangi Tribunal was hearing the Waiho 2575 claim. And we were alive to a whole lot of challenge everywhere around us. And I thought the challenge is great. Let's not try and push it away, but let's actually bring it in, and let's see if we can make something work from that challenge. And of course, this the emergence of Kotui Haura, which was an alliance between the boards of Auckland, Waitemata and Northland, and iwi groupings in the far north. This alliance started to come together, and it came together in a really timely way because it was very tricky to pull off, because effectively what we had decided to do was that for the boards to surrender in part some of their decision-making power to the collective, being the boards themselves and the iwi conglomerates, and actually have a go at seeing if we shared power around these matters, would we do a different thing? And as fate would have it, Minister David Clark signed off this proposition, giving this degree of delegation to boards to engage like this and to be involved in what was effectively power sharing, and along came COVID. And so what occurred was this alliance then snapped into immediate action, and there was an enormous amount of Maori leadership in that outcome, whereby they took control of how we would look after the interests of people in the northern region particularly. So if you remember during the first bit of COVID lockdown that Maori shut the roads to Northland, well, that was Kotui Haura in that space. It was hugely controversial, but we were backing it. And one of the things that occurred during that process was that the money we were putting in, which was significant, was being used for health services that included food and water for people. And you know, that was because that's what the community said they needed. They were in the middle of a drought, and food supplies were short because you couldn't come out of your houses very easily, apart from going to the supermarket, and the money was short. So here was this example of you know, some of the most powerful economic engines in those areas. And, you know, the Auckland DHB is the fourth biggest business in Auckland. Surrendering some of its power to decide to a collective that included itself, and allocating resources to what you would call non-traditional health areas because they were the right thing to do. And for all that to be in the leadership of the Maori cohort doing this, who were in the delivery vein. This was a terrific eye-opener and has provided us, I think, with some of the insight we've been developing with Kotui Haura about just how do you actually use the resources available by the state to be the most effective intervener in providing treaty-related expertise and capacity to Māori, equity-related expertise and capacity to Pacific, and to re-engineer the way you run your business such that people who were formerly underserved now became served at the norm around this. And I think in particular areas of our business we've managed to do that. And I regard that as a really big shift and move, and a sense of a signal to what is possible when you pay attention to things. So the racism issue that kind of comes to that is, if this was possible in a pandemic and in this, what's been stopping us from thinking like this and acting like this? And you have to say that really the most effective thing I think the government on my time has done was the decision of Longi's government in 1984 to extend the Waitangi Tribunal's purview to back to 1840, and therefore to give the opportunity for people to examine the question of who was in the photograph in 1840, who was on the whenua in 1840, and what's happened since then, and what do we do about it. And this has been probably the most inspirational journey in my life, is to be part of that process. For me, it began with, I suppose, in 1970 as a school kid. I objecting to the All Blacks going to South Africa, lying down in front of the bus that was going to go out to the airport, and the bus simply rolled around me. And then in 1976, taking a petition to the board of the Takapuna Rugby Club to withdraw from the rugby competition because of the 1976 tour to South Africa, and the fact that while apartheid was in play like that, we were contributing to support it, and finding actually in the articulation of the why we would want to oppose that, the matters to do with the brown population in our own country became front and centre, which you can imagine in a rugby club circumstance was pretty interesting and tough stuff, but it was great training, if you like, for the conversations about racism. And by the time we got through 1977-78 with the Bastion Point occupation, where it started to become alive that there was problems afoot and we got to do something about them. I was part of the anti-racism movement in the 1981 Springbok tour, and the bell that was ringing during that process was this, is that, you know, you're walking arm in arm with us, Māori and Pacific, on the streets here around apartheid in South Africa. But, you know, after this conversation has happened here, we're going to have another one about what it's like for racism in New Zealand. And it was really clear and aware, I was aware that as a Pākehā and a Pālangi in those contexts, you couldn't avoid the nuanced shift that was going to take place, that was going to catch us, if you like, by bringing us into a conversation that we were going to feel uncomfortable about. And, you know, post-1981 Springbok tour, Ngāti Whātua re-occupied Bastion Point. I joined it and got arrested there. And in the course of doing that, got connected with Ngāti Whātua in a way that I hadn't been before, and it opened up my life. I mean, without question, you know, I brought some things to them in terms of organisational and financial skills and a bit of kind of networking and economic nous and how you get businesses up and stuff like that. But they brought to me a kind of a domestication into Māori life in a place where they had been all but suppressed. You know, the words of the Waitangi Tribunal, you know, in the case for Ngāti Whātua, where they were regarded as migrants in their own land, you know, that is a particularly galling experience. And so to be engaged with Joe, and Joe asked me to help him be their economic advisor and then get involved with the family and the whānau to actually be engaged in the process of getting back Bastion Point. And, you know, in 1988, the government said yes, it would go back, and in 1991 it went back. You know, and I was party to that conversation in the minister's office with Joe and his whānau and Hugh Kāwharu in there, where there was quite significant tension between the players because of the various strategies each had had in pursuing that. But, you know, when you're caught up with the domestic articulation of what do we do next because we still haven't got the land, what's the next play, who's the next person we see, what's the next argument we have. So, you know, what happened there was I got friendship with Māori who were classically working class, Joe and Rini and the whānau, and classically upper class with Hugh, you know, as the professor at Auckland University and what have you. And these groupings seemed to find my company okay. And I was really intrigued to be in it and to be part of a strategy maker and you know, part of a group of Māori and Pākehā who were pushing on to see what we could do about it all. So in the course of doing that, you get a domesticated view about what racism looks like. When you're taken off your whenua, for example. When you are separated from your schooling, for example. when you haven't got nothing to eat, when, you haven't got furniture in your house. And as a, Pākehā Irish Catholic, coming out of a family of lawyers and what have you, we'd never experienced that kind of difficulty in our immediate generations. So to be exposed to it and to understand it gave you a kind of an insight, which was, for me, an early signal that this is probably where I wanted to put a fair bit of my life. And working with Ngāti Whātua became part of what I did, not the whole thing, but a part of what I did. And seeing their struggle and being part of the kind of argument to support them in the recovery of takaparawha, but also in the economic development. The reflexes around Māori in the commercial economic development were always suspicious in those days. Late 80s, early 90s, Māori weren't trusted to be able to do economic development stuff, and it was so wrong. So to be in a place where you actually were helping to write that was phenomenal, and the leadership of Joe and Hugh, but in different ways, was extremely powerful. But the women of Ngāti Whātua, who keep that thing going through some heinous stuff, was so inspirational, if you like, that it was possibly the best learning experiences of my whole professional career. And gave me right down at the domestic front level what racism looks like when you're having your land removed, when you're told you don't belong, when people say, who the hell are you, when you assert your rangatiratanga on your own land, and even when others who are Māori contest you the right to be in the space you're in. Boy, oh boy, this is a complicated life. And it's not a life that Pākehā New Zealand experiences. So one of the interesting things about racism that you get to know about pretty quickly is that for most Pākehās, they have difficulty talking about it because they don't experience it, because we're the majority culture here, or we have been. We're moving away from that. Whereas for Māori, it is the meat and drink of life, where somebody chooses to serve or not serve you, whether a bank chooses to provide you a mortgage or not provide you a mortgage, where you come into a job interview and the fact that you've got a willingness to connect your whakapapa to this process is regarded as incidental to the aspect that when you're in the line for jobs and the name is Smith and the name is something else, Māori, that the ones put aside and the others, and people say, oh, we don't do that, but they do it all the time. And by reflex, it's done. If that person's Māori, they couldn't be up to that job. So I felt and saw that and experienced it with them. I didn't experience it myself, and this is one of the complexities of being Pākehā in this place, is that you're alongside it, you're a participant in it, but you're not impacted in it in the same way. I walk home to a circumstance where everything is actually running fine for me, thanks very much. The government knows who I am and what my needs are and is playing to those needs. If you're Māori and you're walking home from some of these circumstances, you're quite aware that in order to get what you need, you've got to fight for it in a way I don't. So the shift and move and the way that we start to talk about racism in New Zealand has to move away from this kind of thing of you're a personal racist in your behaviour, to the fact that the way in which the system is set up is so pejorative so often that it enables people to benefit one way if you're white and not if you're not. And a really good example of this, and these are things which are both intentional and non-intentional. If you think about the allocation of resources in a health service, and you think that everybody should be able to get, for example, elective services at roughly the same rates of eligibility and for the same sorts of things. And then you have a system that lines you up to that process, firstly from the referral from a GP if you happen to have a GP, or if you don't happen to have a GP, because in fact when somebody wants to turn up to enrol in a primary care organisation, they tell them the roll's closed, and the next day someone else turns up and the roll's open again. You know, people think these things don't happen. These things really do happen, and they happen regularly, and they happen subtly. And so, for example, if I'm a Maori woman with multiple kids and I've got to come in for something to do with bowel cancer or whatever, and I've got to get the time, and I'm on my own, and I've got to get a car park, or I've got to get in here, and I've got to have someone look after the kids, and I don't turn up because I'm not able to pull all that stuff together in the time that is available of 30 minutes that is allocated to me in the system, I am a did not attend. And so I'm a DNA, and as soon as I become a DNA, I am in the system a problem. Here's a person who won't turn up for what they need. What can we do to help them? Well, we can ask them again, but unless we address the problem that got in there in the first place, we won't get it. So, you know, one of the ways you deal with that at a systematic level is you start changing the language. And one of the things you call a DNA is not a did not attend, but a did not attract. What is it our system is not attracting, how we're not attracting you in to do the best thing for your health that you should be able to get? Because surely that's in both our common interests. So if our attraction to you to be able to provide this for you, which we are legally required to provide, and which the state funds to provide, is offered to you in a way that you can't accept it, who's at fault here? And you see, that's quite a tricky conversation for people to actually face. Because for years and generations, people say, you know, it's your own fault. If you don't turn up, it's your own fault. Whereas if we don't make it possible for people to be there at the time that's capable for them to actually have the interaction, which is going to give them the next stage in the journey, then we've failed. And a really, really positive antidote to this was during the lockdown. As we went to much more health online, as people actually communicated over cell phones, believe it or not, a thing we thought could never be possible before. What happened is the DNA rate went down because people got access to the service they needed without the complications of having to get to the service. And then when the service was nuanced enough for them to know that they needed more, then they could prioritise that getting more in a way that just turning up to the first appointment wasn't quite the same priority. Now, you learn a lot about this when the system is upturned as it was during COVID. We learned, for example, that the Pacific community could get out to its own community really efficiently when everybody was locked down in the houses, and that they could provide for better access to service and more support for people in difficulty when they were in circumstances like that. So that you have to take this kind of learning and understand this is challenging to a system which thinks it's worked out how to serve everybody the same way for years, and finds quite often when presented with the data of why things don't work, resistant to change until something sparks that change. In ADHB, we decided to set up these institutional racism workshops, and they were led very ably by the chair of the CEO of the DHB, Ailsa Clare, who bravely took them on in the system, and people started turning up to these things. And we got these conversations going inside the DHB, and meanwhile we went down at a service level and said, let's do deep dives into these services and tell us from the data, what's the story about the Maori woman who couldn't get X, the Pākehā man who got Y, and how come these two people were treated differently in this process? And when they did the deep dives, they found a whole lot of accumulative behaviours which on their own wouldn't have necessarily triggered you, but add them all together and you have people being served one way in 30 days, another day in 400 days. And you ask yourself, how is this possible? And it's because not enough attention had been paid to this phenomena. So we introduced navigators into the system, both Māori and Pacific navigators, generally at a nurse practitioner level or equivalent. And these navigators, by taking a referral from GP right from the beginning and through the patient journey with the journey, over 4,000 cases in about a 6-month period, demonstrated absolutely unequivocally that you could actually have outcomes which were similar across the populations.
Ka pai.
The investment in the navigation enabled the person who was looking for the service to be treated in their own language, to be treated with their own cultural practices, to actually hear somebody like them who had the professional standing to be in support and an advocate for them, taking them through the delivery system and coming out the other end looking exactly like the ordinary population, the Pākehā population.
Ka pai.
So these things are challenging to us. But what was happening there is that the clinical community was actually saying, this is quite good for us. We're hearing this, we see it now. And so we've started this process of taking on board the questions of what does institutional racism look like in the system that you're a part of, that we're all a part of? What does it look like down at a service level? What does it look like down at a clinical practice level? What does it look down at an analysis level? And what can we do about it to shift and change it? And that's serious work, and I'm very proud of it. And it's going to make a very big difference in that space.
Ka pai.
But you see, if you think about health, one of the reasons I got involved in education was Heke Parata was Minister of Education, and in 2013 released a document about PISA examination, meaning the way we compare the outcomes for education in New Zealand versus the rest of the world at a secondary school level. And Pākehā New Zealand was second in the world. Māori were 30th and Pacific were 44th. And, I looked at that thing and I thought, here's another example that this is, what this is suggesting is Māori and Pacific people are thick. That's what it's suggesting. That's what this kind of analysis is saying. And I'm saying that is simply not the truth. And that people are using that kind of, it's too hard. That exactly the same things we find in the health system, you switch them over into the education system and they are there writ large everywhere. And that's why the formation of Manaia Kalani, which we got involved with providing high-end digital both training and equipment for low decile New Zealand, Māori and Pacifica particularly, has meant a radical shift and change in that process. Now, all these things can be done, but the thing you have to actually address to get them to do is you have to address the truth. And the truth is awkward, because often those who have to address the truth and change the norm are people who have benefited from the value of having the focus on themselves. So as a Pākehā, I've hugely benefited by the fact that the systems are set up for me to be able to access them in a way which is entirely intuitive to my needs. But if I don't look like me and I haven't come from where I've come from, that's not the case often. And it's not the case often because people tell us so and we don't believe them. So in effect, we have to change it. And you only have to see, for example, the long trail of conversation about oranga tamariki to understand how hard it is for the group affected to have the voice heard which says this is not right. Doesn't mean that we've got every single answer, but what we're doing right now is not right, and therefore we have to change it. Hence the review and hopefully some form of dynamic shift in that process. But the signals are around everywhere that if you're brown, you haven't had a great deal. And that if you're Māori, the ability of you to actually have the full-blooded conversations which are constitutional in their derivation, but are cultural in their application and are entirely about a better New Zealand, it's really hard to get those things done in such a way that there's an outcome which changes as a result of that conversation. And so the introduction by the Crown here of the Māori Health Authority is a superlative opportunity set. Right here, we've got a government who has decided that the voice has to be heard, and it has to be heard in a constitutional frame. So, for example, this is not a Māori and Pacific Health Authority. This is a Māori Health Authority. Yeah. This is a Te Tiriti-based response to health requirements. This will be staffed and governed by Māori, and it will be properly funded. And here you have the emergence of imagination, where instead of being nervous about the fact that Māori might take something away from us, here we have the investment in bringing something to all of us. And you know, the thing that this will bring to all of us over time is a so much more coherent response to Māori and health, which will lift Māori life expectancy. It will lift the access to medical care at a younger age. It will address in lots of different ways Māori rangatiratanga over their own health. The ability of Māori mana motuhaki to actually take control of these things. The idea that you actually don't have to sit and wait for a Māori response for something, but the Māori response is the full response to something. The fact that the way in which we will start to very quickly, I'm sure, lean on that Māori authority to provide us with expertise to run the bigger show, but to run it from a different kaupapa positioning. This is truly, potentially, revolutionary in New Zealand, and I think it's apprehensive to older New Zealanders.
Is that where you think the nub of racism resides? Is that a kind of a space which feeds itself and is self-referential? Because I mean, it's extraordinary to listen to your history, your part in that last 30, 40 years of the history of the interface of racism and people trying to do things differently. But it makes me wonder, what's perpetuating the racism that we see? What's perpetuating the pushback that we see to all these very important changes?
I think the first thing about that you need to understand about for a Pākehā New Zealander would almost never describe themselves as racist, right? Now, if you're of a generation above me, so I'm 66, so if you're older than I am, the notion of New Zealand you've grown up with in your head is that this has been God's own country. It's been a fair and decent place. Māori were lucky that we colonised them, that we gave them opportunity that they wouldn't have had as a result of technology and all the rest of it. That, yeah, we did some bad things, and we need to pay attention to those. And in fact, in one respect, you know, one of the things the Waitangi Tribunal has managed is to get pretty much all New Zealanders thinking that's a good idea, right? So that people are actually saying, yes, we need to pay attention to those things, but don't for God's sake call me racist, because I don't feel that way. And why should I be responsible for somebody who simply isn't paying attention to their own lives and doing the things they should be doing? Right. You know, if they're letting their kids run around all over the place, if they're, you know, committing crime and going to jail, why should I be responsible for that sort of stuff? You know, it's people lacking self-determination, self-respect, if you like, you know. Now, that's probably a reasonable positioning, and these days I don't spend a lot of time on that any longer, because I don't think we can do anything about that worldview, because it is held genuinely, and it is, but it is of an older view. Now, if you think at the next generation down, people who are somewhere between 30 and 55, they've been through the whole treaty process. They came the treaty came in at a point where they were kind of just growing up, and they've lived with the debate and and it's ebbed and flowed. From time to time, it's been attacked. Don Brash took it to task in 2006 and said basically if he was Prime Minister, the treaty, we'd finish all the stuff to do with the claims, and that'd be the end of the treaty. It'd be out the door, and it didn't happen, right? And it won't happen now. The thing about this, the treaty now is part of our worldview and part of our being. The fact that we've got an explosion of te reo in the community at the moment is stunning, and it's everywhere. And people are using it in all sorts of contexts that you would not expect people to use it in. People are using it in holy Pākehā environments, using te reo, and formal evening things and all this sort of stuff. This is really a symbol, I think, of the shift and move, because you don't start speaking the language of the other unless you've actually changed your mind about the value of that. You don't start allowing yourself to be influenced by that unless something's moved in your head and your heart. And that is happening in New Zealand. Doesn't mean we still have got a whole lot of stuff that we have to deal with. But if I think about that and take it back to 1982 and the second occupation of Bastion Point, none of that was around the town. In fact, Māori weren't speaking Māori much at that point. Now, that's not the case now. And what's more, we're seeing the consolidation emerging of major Māori enterprise. We are seeing Māori play in the political arena a wholly different way. If you think about the health reforms, Māori and the Labour Party were huge in that process. So my instincts about all of this are that there's something very positive going on here. It's not to say there isn't a whole lot of negative pushback about it, but there is something hugely positive here, and we need to ride the wave here. And I think that one of the ways we've talked about having the difficulties of racism talked about the DHB is to frame it like this. Let's practice radical democracy. Radical democracy is the ability of people to actually express what they think about an issue in the way they need to express it and to be heard for that expression. But let's not assume that the expression itself means that we do nothing. Democracy requires the group makes up its mind about what it's going to do. So in the DHB, we've had really tricky and important, and I must say, debates with significant integrity where people have had very long disagreements with each other, especially in the early days, about the matters to do with would preferencing Māori be destabilising Pākehā access to service.
Right.
Would, if we went down this route, would I miss out? To a much more sophisticated thing here now 3 years on, where people are able to disagree about stuff, but the arguments are getting more and more sophisticated. And instead of voting against somebody, somebody says, actually, I hear what you say, I don't agree with it, but I'm not going to get in the way of it, because that's the thing to do.
And is it your sense that the korowai, if you like, or the umbrella term tangata tiriti is a helpful term
Beautiful
to help
term.
Pākehā people, tangata tiriti
Beautiful
people,
term.
navigate their role in this radical democracy that you're talking about?
That's a Mason jury moment, I think, wasn't it? Tangata tiriti. And I think it's absolutely right, because essentially what it does, it encapsulates all white and brown on this side. Not on the tangata whenua side, but on this side. So if you're from Asia or from the Philippines or from Samoa or from whatever, you're part of tangata tiriti. And that it's a really, really handy and useful mechanism for actually saying that's the constitutional arrangements, is that this has not been special for Māori, this has been constitutional for Māori. This is Māori doing the thing we agreed to do, and we supporting that thing. And over here, we've been the beneficiaries of that. And what's more, when they do this well, we'll be greater beneficiaries of this. Because what's going to be hugely obvious shortly, and I mean in the next 2 decades, I think in those sort of terms, is that shifts like this won't be just constrained to the health process. Other things will happen. If you look at koinga reo movement in the education thing, and look at the results that are getting now, you know, and much of the kura that are doing well, they're doing superbly well.
Absolutely, that was recently reported, wasn't
Yeah.
it? So what are your thoughts about the future over the next couple of decades? As you say, that's a nice chunk of time to think about. You know, we do things in health, we do things in education and justice, in care and protection. We still seem to struggle to join those things together, Pat. And I can't help wondering, I really want to know what advice you have for people in leadership roles over the next 20 years, trying to eradicate racism and all the things that feed that racism in a way to make us more cohesive and to learn from these different settings as you've described today, so that we don't have to duplicate these things again and again in all the different sectors. We can actually learn about how to get rid of racism because it works across all those settings.
Yeah, so I think one of the things here is that if I think of a shift that has taken place post the beginning of the new century, is that for quite a long time when we were talking about racism and the impact on Māori, for example, of racism, we would say, well, let's let Māori tell us what that looks like, right? And so Māori were the articulators of their own pain. And people would say, well, we hear you, right? In effect, my experience now as people go on, they say, you Pākehās, you've got to actually work this out for yourself. We're engaged in the pursuit of our own rangatiratanga, thanks very much. We're not your spokesman on your pain. You have to actually work this out and address it with your own people. And I think more and more that's probably the way that we've got to do it. And it's perfectly capable of being done. The other day I went to see Russell McVeigh. They wanted me to come and talk to them about treaty and all this sort of stuff. So I did the thing that I normally do, which is actually face people with the fact that if you're Māori in New Zealand, you're in a bad way in terms of the structures and the way things work. And there's plenty of evidence to say it's improving, but it ought not to be there in the first place. So what are we going to do about it? And don't go asking Māori for advice about what to do about it. Actually address it here inside your own business. How many Māori have you got in your internship? Where are you going to search for people to actually be really capable in this? And when people come into this context, how much does it count that they're Māori? Or are they just somebody else? You know, what do we do here to actively and positively change our behaviour, stance and aspiration for people, and not forever be looking for Māori to solve our race problem? We've got to solve the race problem ourselves, and we've got to do it by using all the tools that we normally use. Decency, respect for each other, plain speaking, taking one on the chin when you need to in order for something to survive, being kind to people, being brave and courageous, going out on a limb and putting yourself at risk to do these things. That's how you shift things. Don't ask Māori to shift it for us. Bastion Point shifted a whole lot for New Zealand, a whole lot. You know, it was just after the land march. You know, it was Whina Cooper's leadership there, you know, which the Hawke family were involved with as well. And then Ngāti Whātua were taking that on. And, you know, I can remember at the time, people saying, who the hell are Ngāti Whātua? Where'd they come from? So it's for us to actually use all the skills we have. And as Pākehā, as tangata tiriti people, we have all our own cultural and moral purpose and, you know, systematic ways of going about changing behaviours. Use them. Engage with us. Don't run from it. Be somebody who's known as somebody who stands for the right thing. You know, make justice the thing you think is really important in your life. And when you're whānau misbehaving about these things, call it out, engage in the discussion, get awkward, and be prepared to be wrong.
Kia ora.
Because lots of the time, the thing you think about something turns out not to be the real thing. And you have to be humble enough to say, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. And I've done that lots of times. But you're better to attack the thing that you think is wrong up front and face the consequence. And you're a better person for it.
E te rangatira. E te pura tuawhiti. Tēnā koe. Thank you so much, Pat, for your wise counsel.
Kia ora, it's been a pleasure to be here. It's been lovely being in your company.
Ka pai.
Ka pai.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. If you'd like to know more about our kaupapa, have a look at our website. Ngā mihi nui.